How far would you go for a second chance? Especially if it meant risking everything for a life you hardly know. Stick with me, because this story isn't just about a rescue. It's about the kind of courage it takes to love with your whole heart, the power of wild connections, and how a single act of compassion can ripple out and heal an entire community. Subscribe to the channel if you want to find out how the bond between a ranger and two wild bobcats turned into a lesson in hope for all of us. The wind screamed outside the ranger cabin, rattling the windows and slamming snow against the log walls like 1,000 desperate hands. Maddie Carter stood in the doorway, peering out into the black night, her breath swirling in frosty clouds. Colorado winters had a way of swallowing everything, turning roads into ribbons of ice, burying trails, forcing even the toughest creatures to hide away. But tonight, Maddie couldn't settle. That familiar, uneasy feeling gnawed at her. The same one she always got when she knew a storm was trouble for the wild things she was supposed to protect. She checked her radio, clipped on her flashlight, and shrugged into her parka just as another gust of wind rattled the cabin. The park's emergency line had stayed silent all night, but her gut told her something was wrong. She paused, scanning the shadows. All she could hear was the thud of her own heartbeat. And then, underneath the roar of the wind, a high, frantic sound that didn't fit. It almost sounded like a cry for help, though not quite human. Maddie stepped off the porch, the cold biting through her jeans before she even made it to the snow. She swept her flashlight across the frozen ground, eyes searching for tracks, ears straining for any sign of life. The wind whipped her hair, stung her cheeks and eyes. For a split second, she thought about turning around, closing the door, pouring another cup of coffee and pretending this was just another long winter night. But she couldn't do it. Not after what happened to her dad. One mistake in the woods, one moment of ignoring his instincts, and he'd paid the price. Maddie had promised herself she'd never make that mistake. The cry came again, closer this time. Maddie followed it, boots crunching in the fresh snow, breath quickening with every step. The woods looked nothing like she remembered. Trees bent under the weight of snow, branches groaning, strange shadows flickering at the edges of her light. The air smelled of pine, cold, and the coming storm. Somewhere above her, an owl called out, as if warning her to turn back, mind her own business. But Maddie pushed deeper, letting her instincts lead her into the wild dark. Then she saw it, a blur of movement at the bottom of a narrow, icy pit, nearly hidden by wind-blown snow. She almost missed it. The opening was barely there, just a shadow where the ground had caved in. Dropping to her knees, she swept her light across the hole and saw a tiny animal huddled close to the frozen earth, shivering, its eyes wide with fear. A bobcat kitten. Maddie's breath caught, a jolt of adrenaline cutting through her tiredness. The kitten's fur was clumped with ice, its sides heaving in panic. Every time it cried, the sound went straight to Maddie's heart, so much like the lost child cries she remembered from her own hardest days. It made her chest ache. She reached out, careful not to scare the little thing. The pit's sides were slick and steep, but Maddie dug her boots in for balance, then lowered herself inch by inch into the hollow, reaching for the kitten. "Come here, sweetheart," she murmured softly, her voice barely audible over the storm. The kitten flinched, but didn't run. She inched closer, arms outstretched, fingers burning from the cold. Her own memories flashed, her father's hands steadying hers as she learned to rescue a trapped fawn, his voice gentle but firm. "Move slow, Maddie. The wild ones are scared. but they want to trust you. She wrapped her parka around the tiny body, shielding it from the wind. The kitten was lighter than she expected, its bones fragile beneath its fur. As she cradled it, she felt its heartbeat flutter against her palm, fast and terrified. Maddie whispered words she hadn't used since she was a child, old prayers for lost things, for second chances. She climbed out, one hand gripping the frozen earth, the other keeping the kitten close. The snow stung her cheeks, but she barely noticed. All she could think about was the warmth of her cabin, the small hope she could save this life. Still, doubts churned inside her. Should she risk the storm for a wild animal? Was it foolish, reckless, even dangerous? But as she started back through the woods, the kitten pressed tight against her. Maddie knew. If she left it behind, she'd regret it forever. Thunder rumbled, distant but threatening. The snow thickened, erasing her tracks almost as quickly as she made them. Maddie's flashlight flickered, then sputtered out completely. Darkness swallowed the forest, and for a moment, Maddie stood completely still, listening to the storm and the frantic beating of her own heart. She was alone out here, with nothing but instinct to guide her. Suddenly, from behind, another sound pierced the night. A deep, guttural growl, wild and fierce. Maddie whirled, clutching the kitten tighter. Two eyes gleamed in the darkness, low to the ground, watching her every move. She wasn't alone after all. But whether the presence in the storm was friend or foe, Maddie couldn't yet tell. She squared her shoulders and pressed on, carrying the fragile bundle through the blizzard toward whatever waited in the shadows. She had made her choice, and there would be no turning back. The storm didn't let up. If anything, the wind grew more savage, clawing at Maddie's coat as she pushed through the drifts, clutching the shivering kitten to her chest. Every few steps she paused, listening, searching the woods for the source of the wild, guttural growl she'd heard. Nothing but shadows and swirling white. Her breath hung heavy in the cold, mingling with the kitten's quick, terrified gasps. She kept moving. There was no choice. The forest had always been her sanctuary, but tonight it felt like a maze of shifting, menacing ghosts. Each tree was a giant in the storm, each snap of a twig a warning. But Maddie kept one hand around the kitten and the other on the radio at her belt, hoping for a miracle, hoping she wouldn't need it. The walk back to the ranger cabin felt endless, as if the blizzard had stretched the land and time itself. Maddie's legs ached from trudging through knee-deep snow, her arms numb from holding the tiny Bobcat close. Yet she barely noticed her discomfort. All she could think about was the kitten, so small, so breakable, its life dangling by a thread she was desperate not to snap. Her mind wandered as she walked, dragged by old memories she'd rather forget. She saw herself as a child, curled in a hospital chair, clutching her father's ranger hat, too stunned to cry. He'd been a legend in their small Colorado town, fearless, kind, never turning away a lost animal or a kid in trouble. Until the night he didn't come home. A freak accident, the papers said. A fallen tree, a storm, bad luck. But Maddie knew it was more than that. She'd replayed it 1,000 times. What if he'd turned back sooner? What if someone had heard his call for help? She'd never gotten over the loneliness that settled in after. Her mother tried, but the loss hollowed them both out. It made Maddie tough. Sometimes too tough, people said. But she couldn't stand the idea of being powerless again, of letting something helpless suffer if she could do anything at all to change it. She blinked away the old grief, focusing on the here and now. The kitten whimpered, a thin, pitiful sound, and she hugged it tighter, whispering the soft reassurances she'd wanted so badly to hear as a kid. "You're gonna be okay. I promise." The lights of the cabin finally winked through the swirling snow, blurry and distant at first, then brighter as she stumbled up the porch. She kicked the snow off her boots, burst through the door, and swung it shut behind her, blocking out the wind. The sudden warmth inside made her dizzy. She fumbled for the light switch, then set the kitten down gently on a folded blanket by the wood stove. Scout, she found herself thinking, giving the kitten a name before she realized she was doing it. Something about the wild, watchful look in its eyes. Scout shivered, mewling weakly, its tiny claws flexing against the wool. Maddie rummaged in the supply closet, pulling out an old animal crate, a heating pad, a clean towel, and a bottle of kitten formula. She moved quickly but gently, careful not to startle Scout any more than it already was. She settled next to the kitten, mixing formula with trembling hands. Scout watched her, wide-eyed and wary, every muscle tensed to bolt. Maddie kept her voice low and soothing, recalling every trick her father had taught her. How to win the trust of a wounded animal. How to make yourself smaller, softer, less frightening. The first sip was a battle. Scout jerked away, then inched back, hunger and fear wrestling inside. Maddie waited, patient, holding the bottle just close enough. Finally, the kitten latched on, suckling greedily. Relief surged through Maddie as she watched Scout drink, the lines of worry easing from its tiny face. She couldn't help but smile. For a moment, the loneliness she carried felt lighter, replaced by something fragile and hopeful. But as the blizzard raged outside, Maddie knew their troubles weren't over. Scout was safe for now, but wild animals didn't just end up alone in the snow by accident. Somewhere out there, a mother was missing her baby, a mother who'd risk anything to get her kitten back. Maddie finished feeding Scout, wiped its whiskers, and tucked it in with the heating pad. She poured herself a mug of instant coffee, sat cross-legged by the fire, and listened to the storm. Her mind replayed every sound she'd heard in the woods, the growl, the rustling, the weight of something watching her from the shadows. What if the mother bobcat was still out there? Hurt, frantic, maybe even dying? Maddie's heart clenched at the thought. She'd seen enough of the wild to know how cruel it could be. Hunters set traps, sometimes even on protected land. She'd spent her whole life patching up wounded deer, untangling foxes, saving orphaned raccoons. Each time, the animals taught her something new about grief and healing, about the fine line between wildness and trust. Tonight, sitting beside Scout, she thought about her own childhood fears, the nights she waited up for her dad, too scared to sleep, too proud to cry. She saw herself in the kitten's trembling, its longing for warmth and safety. Suddenly a sound shattered her thoughts, a scratching at the door, low and urgent. Maddie's pulse jumped. She stood up, reaching for the flashlight, heart pounding in her chest. Was it the wind? Or something else? She moved slowly, careful not to frighten Scout, who huddled deeper into the blanket. The scratching came again, sharper this time, followed by a soft, guttural yowl. Maddie crept to the window and peered out. In the swirling snow, a shadow moved, low, limping, unmistakably wild. Two eyes glowed back at her, filled with terror, pain, and something fierce as love. The mother bobcat had come. Maddie's breath caught. She knew this moment could turn dangerous, fast. A wild animal, wounded and desperate, could be unpredictable, even deadly. But as she looked into those wild, pleading eyes, Maddie felt a strange, aching connection. The loneliness inside her met the mother's fear, and something wordless passed between them. She pressed her palm to the glass, whispering to Scout's mother even though she knew the words didn't matter. "I'm not here to hurt you. I promise." But promises didn't mean much to the wild. Outside, the bobcat circled, limping, yowling for her lost kitten. Inside, Maddie's resolve hardened. She wasn't just saving a life tonight. She was standing at the edge of her own sorrow, trying to build a bridge across it. The storm raged on, but for the first time, Maddie wasn't afraid of the darkness, not with Scout by her side and a wild mother at her door. The wind had calmed by the time a faint gray light crept into the sky. The storm's worst fury had passed, but the world outside Maddie's cabin was a frozen wilderness of silence and shadows. Inside, the warmth from the wood stove gave a fragile sense of safety, but Maddie hadn't slept a minute. Every hour she'd checked on Scout, who dozed fitfully on the heating pad, twitching and dreaming, sometimes crying out in the dark. Maddie soothed her with gentle touches and low whispers, but her mind kept drifting back to the eyes she'd seen in the storm. Those wild, haunted eyes peering through the window, desperate and fierce. She sipped cold coffee, perched on the edge of the battered sofa, boots still on, mind racing with 1,000 worries. Her job as a park ranger meant she'd seen just about everything the wild could throw at a person. Bear break-ins, elk stampedes, even the occasional cougar on a porch. But this was different. This was about heartbreak and hope, loss and survival, tangled together in the heart of winter. The scratching at the door started again, low and frantic, making Scout stir and whimper. Maddie crossed the room and lifted the edge of the curtain. Outside, dawn painted the snow in bruised shades of blue and silver. The world looked peaceful, but in the half-light, a shape waited, a bobcat, bigger than a house cat, but not by much, fur bristling, body tense. She paced in the snow, limping badly, her left foreleg drawn tight against her body. Blood stained the white around her paw. Maddie's breath caught. The mother, surely. Wounded and desperate, she circled the cabin, yowling softly, sniffing at the cracks beneath the door. Maddie felt her pulse hammering. Instinct told her to keep the door locked. Wild animals were dangerous when cornered or hurt. But another feeling, deeper and harder to ignore, said this animal wasn't just hunting for food. She was here for her baby. Scout, sensing the presence of her mother, began to mewl and cry. Maddie knelt beside the crate, gently stroking the kitten's back. "She's here, little one. Your mama found you," Maddie murmured, trying to calm her own nerves. She weighed her options. Call animal control? Sedate the bobcat and bring her in? Her mind flashed to the snare wound, a telltale sign of a poacher's trap. She couldn't ignore it. The law was clear about not interfering with wild animals unless there was real danger. But Maddie had always believed that compassion was its own kind of law. She remembered her father's stories of risking his own skin to save a wolf pup, of the times he'd bent the rules for the sake of a single life. She decided to try something bold. Maddie dug out a thick pair of gloves, a small first aid kit, and a tranquilizer dart, her last resort. She filled a bowl with fresh water and another with ground turkey, then cracked the door open just an inch. Cold air rushed in, carrying the sharp, wild scent of the bobcat. The mother stopped, hackles rising, golden eyes fixed on Maddie. "Easy, girl. I'm not your enemy," Maddie whispered, pushing the food and water onto the porch and stepping back, leaving the door ajar. The bobcat hesitated. She sniffed the air, caught the scent of her kitten inside, and limped toward the bowls. Hunger and worry etched in every line of her body. She devoured the meat, drank deep, then returned to the door, pressing her nose against the gap, yowling softly for Scout. Maddie could feel the mother's pain, raw and unguarded. Every inch of her radiated both terror and devotion, a wild love that was willing to cross any line, even the one dividing human and animal. The moment felt suspended, every sound amplified. Scout's cries, the mother's answering yowls, Maddie's own breath. For a wild animal, this trust was unnatural, dangerous even. But for a mother, Maddie realized, nothing was more natural than risking everything for a child. Maddie gently picked up Scout, wrapping her in the blanket. She knelt at the doorway, holding the kitten out so her mother could see. The bobcat's ears flicked, and for a moment, her body coiled as if she might lunge. Maddie didn't move. She met the wild cat's gaze, steady and open. The two stared at each other across the threshold, woman and bobcat, both worn by worry, both haunted by loss. "Look, she's safe," Maddie said, voice barely above a whisper. "But you're hurt. Let me help." She saw the moment the bobcat recognized Scout. Her body trembled, her tail lashed, her yowl rising into something close to a sob. Scout squirmed and reached a paw toward her mother, mewing desperately. But the wild mother couldn't come in, not without a fight. She limped away, then circled back, unable to leave. Maddie's heart broke for her. She knew that kind of helplessness, the terror of losing someone and being unable to fix it. Then, a new danger flickered at the edge of her mind. What if the poachers came back for their trap? The woods were full of risks for an injured animal. Maddie realized she had to do more than just offer food. She needed to get the snare off the mother bobcat to give her a real chance. She took a deep breath, grabbed the tranquilizer, and eased out onto the porch. The mother bobcat growled, flattening her ears, warning Maddie not to come closer. Maddie spoke softly, inching forward, her every movement deliberate. She remembered her father's words. "Trust is built, not given. You gotta earn it, Maddie." She knelt in the snow, lowering the dart gun but keeping it ready, just in case. The mother bobcat watched her, torn between fear and hope. Scout mewed again, and the mother's resolve broke. She limped closer, her golden eyes shining with agony and love. Maddie waited until the mother bobcat was focused on Scout, then reached out slowly, showing her empty hands. "I just want to help," she murmured. But wild things don't always listen, and sometimes neither does fear. The mother's leg buckled and she collapsed in the snow, too weak to fight, her breathing ragged. Maddie saw the snare wound up close, a cruel, bloody line around her ankle. She moved fast. Using her gloves and every bit of courage she had, she cut the wire free and sprayed the wound with antiseptic. The mother bobcat flinched, but didn't attack. She was too exhausted. Maddie stroked her fur gently, speaking soft nonsense, trying to offer comfort. She felt the bobcats trembling, her heart pounding under her ribs. As the sky lightened, Maddie finished tending the wound, then backed away, giving the mother space. The bobcat rose unsteadily, locking eyes with Maddie, then with Scout. For a few precious moments, the world held its breath as mother and kitten pressed noses through the open door. A mother's love, Maddie thought, is the fiercest force in nature. As dawn broke fully over the mountains, Maddie knew she'd done more than just save a life. She'd become part of a story much bigger than her own. Dawn unfolded slowly over the Colorado wilderness, brushing the world in pale blue light. Maddie sat cross-legged on the cabin floor, her hands trembling with exhaustion and relief. The night had drained every last drop of energy from her body, but she barely noticed her own fatigue. Her whole being was attuned to the two wild creatures in her care. Scout, the tiny bobcat kitten, nestled against her chest, while Willow, the name Maddie chose for the wounded mother, lay just outside the cabin, curled in the snow, her golden eyes fixed on the door. Inside, the warmth of the wood stove melted the last traces of frost from Scout's whiskers. Maddie gently wiped the kitten's face, then held her up to the window. Outside, Willow's ears perked, her nose twitching at the familiar scent. Maddie's heart ached for them both, separated by glass, by fear, by the invisible line between wild and human. Maddie spent the early morning tending to Willow's injury. After freeing the snare and cleaning the wound, she left fresh water and food just outside the door, watching from a distance as Willow limped over, her gait uneven but determined. Every so often, Willow would glance at the window, drawn by the tiny cries of her kitten. Maddie saw the longing, the frustration, and the fierce love in the mother bobcat's eyes. "I wish I could explain," Maddie whispered, voice thick with emotion. "She's safe. I promise." But words meant nothing to the wild. As the day stretched on, Maddie realized she couldn't keep Scout inside forever. The kitten needed her mother, and Willow needed Scout just as much. Still, Maddie knew releasing the kitten too soon could be disastrous. Scout was weak, barely able to walk, and a sudden move might frighten both animals, undoing all the trust she'd worked so hard to build. So Maddie made a plan. She found an old kennel in the shed, large enough for both mother and baby to share, but secure enough to keep them safe while Willow recovered. She lined it with blankets, tucked it against the side of the cabin, and placed Scout inside, keeping the door open but blocking the exit with a heavy crate. Willow watched every move, pacing in the snow, torn between caution and longing. Maddie stepped back, keeping her distance, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. "Come on, Willow. She's right here," Maddie called softly, her breath curling in the cold. Willow hesitated at first, ears flattened, tail flicking with uncertainty. She crept forward, step by agonizing step, drawn by the sound of her kitten's mews. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Maddie hardly dared to breathe as Willow stretched her neck, peered into the kennel, and finally, slowly, brushed her nose against Scout's tiny head. For a moment, everything stopped. The only sound was the soft, desperate purring as mother and kitten nuzzled, reunited at last. Tears stung Maddie's eyes as she watched the silent exchange. In that instant, all the pain and fear of the past day seemed to melt away. She saw herself reflected in Willow, a mother fighting against impossible odds to protect her child. She thought of her own mother, stoic and strong after her father died, holding Maddie tight through every storm, refusing to let her daughter disappear into grief. Willow curled protectively around Scout, grooming her with slow, careful licks. The kitten pressed close, kneading her mother's chest, finally at peace. Maddie let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, but the work wasn't done. Willow was still weak from blood loss and hunger, and Scout wouldn't survive without round-the-clock care. Maddie stayed near the kennel, bottle-feeding the kitten through the wire, whispering encouragement to both bobcats as the hours slipped by. She checked Willow's wound every few hours, reapplying antiseptic and coaxing her to eat small pieces of meat. At first, Willow greeted every approach with a snarl, ears back, ready to strike if Maddie got too close. But hunger and exhaustion dulled her anger, and Maddie's gentle persistence gradually wore down the walls between them. She moved slowly, always speaking in soft, reassuring tones, never making sudden moves. She learned to read Willow's body language, the twitch of an ear, the widening of her eyes, the subtle shift of her weight as she decided whether to trust or to fight. Little by little, progress came. By the second day, Willow let Maddie place food in the kennel without growling. By the third, she accepted a bowl of water directly from Maddie's hand, though her gaze never wavered, always alert for any sign of threat. At night, Maddie sat on the porch, wrapped in a heavy blanket, watching the stars flicker through the bare branches. Sometimes she talked to her father, or to the wild world itself, asking for wisdom and strength. She thought about all the creatures she'd helped over the years, the wounded deer, the frightened fox kits, the lonely owls, and realized that every act of compassion was a step toward healing, not just for the animals, but for herself as well. Inside the kennel, Willow and Scout curled up together, breathing in sync, their bodies a single warm shape against the cold. Maddie felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, a quiet understanding that some wounds, no matter how deep, could be mended by patience, kindness, and the will to try. On the fourth morning, as dawn painted the world in soft gold, Willow lifted her head and looked directly at Maddie. For the first time, there was no fear in her eyes, only a guarded curiosity, a tentative recognition of the person who had saved her life. Maddie smiled, blinking back tears. "We're all beneath the same sky, Willow," she whispered, hope blooming in her chest. "Maybe we're not so different after all." And as the new day began, the fragile bond between human and wild grew just a little stronger, carrying them all one step closer to healing. The days that followed were a blur of care and vigilance, the kind of quiet tension that comes when peace feels too fragile to last. Maddie's life narrowed to a handful of routines: feeding Scout, checking Willow's wound, keeping the fire burning, and scanning the endless white world outside for signs of anything amiss. Trust was growing, delicate as spring grass beneath the snow. Scout grew stronger, playing with the frayed edge of Maddie's jacket, batting at stray strings and rolling clumsily in the kennel. Willow's limp became less pronounced. She watched Maddie through wary, intelligent eyes, her suspicion gradually tempered by necessity. Maddie felt the change most keenly at night. The blizzard had moved on, but the forest silence was its own kind of storm. Sometimes she'd step out onto the porch, wrapped in her thickest blanket, and just listen. The hoot of an owl, the distant crack of ice shifting on the river, the wind threading through the pines. In these moments, she realized just how deeply this winter had changed her, too. The loneliness she'd carried since losing her father had softened, replaced by the warmth of purpose and connection. But Colorado's wilderness had a way of reminding its caretakers that peace could never be taken for granted. It was on the third morning that Maddie first noticed the tracks. 2 sets, pressed deep into the snow near the tree line, much larger than any animal she'd expect this close to the cabin. Boots. Human. Maddie crouched to study them, her breath fogging in the cold. She traced their path with her eyes, from the forest, past the shed, circling toward the back of the cabin, then vanishing into the trees again. Her heart hammered in her chest. Who would be out here in the dead of winter? The only people braving the storm lately were rangers, or worse, poachers. A sick feeling gnawed at her. She hurried back to the cabin, double-checking the locks, then peered out at Willow and Scout. Willow was tense, her tail flicking, every muscle ready to spring. Even Scout seemed subdued, clinging to her mother's side. Maddie scanned the yard, every nerve tuned to the slightest motion. It happened in the early afternoon. A muffled clang out by the edge of the property. Maddie grabbed her radio and her old rifle, instincts kicking in. She followed the noise, boots crunching through crusted snow, her breath tight with anxiety. She moved quietly, years of ranger training guiding her steps, until she saw them. Two men, bundled in camouflage, digging at the base of a pine. In their hands, glinting in the sun, were lengths of steel cable. Poachers. Rage and fear surged through Maddie. She watched from behind a fallen log, taking stock. The men were working quickly, setting new snares in the same place where Willow had been caught. One of them glanced toward the cabin, and Maddie's blood ran cold. Had they seen her? Or worse, did they know about Willow and Scout? She had to act fast. She ducked back, heart pounding, and radioed the nearest ranger station. Static. The storm must have knocked out the main signal. She was on her own. Back at the cabin, she moved quickly. She scooped Scout into her arms and led Willow, coaxing her with soft words and pieces of meat, into the shed, her makeshift safe house for emergencies. Willow hesitated at the doorway, wild eyes wide, but Scout's plaintive mewling finally convinced her. Maddie barricaded the door from the inside, then pressed her ear to the wall, straining for any sound outside. The poachers moved closer. She heard their boots crunching, their low voices as they argued over something. Maybe whether to check the outbuildings, maybe whether to come back later. Willow pressed herself protectively in front of Scout, a low growl rumbling in her chest, ready to defend her kitten at any cost. Maddie crouched beside them, adrenaline racing through her veins, every sense on high alert. One of the men rattled the shed door. Maddie clutched the rifle tighter, swallowing hard. She knew she couldn't let them find the Bobcats. If they did, there'd be no mercy. Poachers in this part of Colorado were ruthless. They saw wildlife as nothing but money on paws. "Hey, you can't be here!" Maddie shouted suddenly, stepping out from her hiding place with the rifle raised. Her voice was stronger than she felt. The men froze, startled. She kept the gun steady, her stance wide. "This is park property. Put down those traps and get off my land before I call every ranger in the county." The poachers exchanged glances, weighing their odds. One of them spat in the snow, muttering a curse. The other eyed Maddie's rifle, then shrugged, hands raised in mock surrender. "We're just hiking. Got a problem with that?" He sneered. Maddie didn't lower the gun. "I saw your traps. You're done here. Move along, and don't come back." After a long, tense moment, the men retreated, grumbling under their breath, casting angry glances back at the cabin as they disappeared into the trees. Maddie stood there, heart pounding, not relaxing until she was certain they were gone. She rushed back to the shed, her hands shaking as she unbarred the door. Willow was still braced protectively in front of Scout, teeth bared, hackles raised. Maddie knelt beside them, whispering soothing words. "It's okay. They're gone. You're safe." The crisis had passed, but Maddie knew the danger wasn't over. Poachers rarely gave up that easily. She needed to stay vigilant, to protect Willow and Scout until they were strong enough to survive on their own. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the snow, Maddie sat in the shed with her unlikely little family. She watched Willow nuzzle Scout, circling her kitten with her body, refusing to leave her side even for a second. Maddie's heart twisted with admiration for the wild mother's courage. They would have to stay hidden for a while longer, but she would do everything in her power to keep them safe. In the deepening dusk, Maddie realized that true strength wasn't about never being afraid. It was about facing the storm together, human and wild, ready to fight for what mattered most. Night fell heavy and silent over the cabin, snow dusting the roof in shimmering silver. Maddie paced the small living room, unable to settle, every muscle in her body taut with worry. The poachers were still out there. She could feel it. Their tracks were too fresh, their anger too raw to just disappear. She checked and rechecked the windows, making sure every curtain was drawn tight, every door locked. Her old rifle leaned against the wall, loaded and within arm's reach. She'd always believed in the best of people, but out here, belief wasn't enough. Action was what mattered. In the shed, Willow and Scout huddled together in the makeshift kennel, a fortress of blankets and hay. Maddie checked on them every hour, shining her flashlight gently so as not to startle the wild mother. Willow's golden eyes reflected the light, fierce and unyielding. Even wounded, Willow had a presence that filled the room, her very existence a challenge to anything that would threaten her baby. Scout, comforted by her mother's warmth, slept deeply, the tiniest of snores rising from her chest. Maddie sat on a wooden stool nearby, head in her hands, wrestling with the choices that lay ahead. She thought of her father, how he'd always told her courage wasn't about having no fear, but about doing what needed to be done even when you were scared out of your mind. She wished he were here now, steady and sure, guiding her through this storm, but all she had was herself, a battered rifle and a promise she'd made, to protect these two, no matter what. Sometime after midnight, Maddie heard the crunch of footsteps outside. Not the scurrying of a fox or the quiet tread of a deer, but heavy, deliberate steps. She froze, heart hammering, every sense sharpened by adrenaline. She slipped the rifle off the wall and crept to the window, peeking through the smallest gap in the curtain. Two figures moving in the moonlight, flashlights bobbing in their hands. The poachers were back. Maddie moved fast, heart thundering. She hurried to the shed, whispering urgent reassurances to Willow and Scout. "Stay here, don't make a sound." She barricaded the door, then slipped around the side of the cabin, her boots muffled in the snow. The poachers were at the edge of the yard, scanning the outbuildings, their voices low and cruel. "She should have finished the job last time," one of them muttered, kicking at the snow. "Bet she's hiding those cats. That's big money gone," the other answered. Maddie felt anger burn in her chest. These men didn't care about life. They only saw profit. She steadied her rifle, not aiming to kill, but determined to protect. A sudden crash echoed from the shed. The poachers had found the door. Maddie sprinted back, yelling, "Get away from there! You're trespassing!" The men spun, one raising a heavy crowbar, the other flashing a wicked grin. "Stay out of this, lady. Not your business." "It is my business. Leave now, or you'll regret it," Maddie warned, rifle raised. The standoff hung in the freezing air, tension thick enough to choke. Then, without warning, Willow burst from the kennel. She must have found a weak spot in the door, driven by terror for her baby. The wild mother placed herself between Maddie and the poachers, fur bristling, teeth bared in a snarl that cut through the night. "Whoa!" one of the men shouted, stumbling backward. Willow didn't back down. She crouched, muscles coiled to spring, her body a living shield for Scout and Maddie alike. Blood still streaked her paw, pain etched in every movement, but she stood her ground, refusing to yield. The poachers faltered, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Maddie, rifle steady, drew on every bit of courage she had. "Leave," "Now," she said, voice low and unyielding. For a long moment, the world seemed to stop. Willow's growl rumbled in the darkness, promising violence if they dared take one step closer. Maddie could see the calculation in the men's eyes. They hadn't counted on facing both an armed ranger and a wild animal ready to die for her young. "Fine, she ain't worth it," the leader spat, backing away. "But you better watch yourself. Next time, you won't be so lucky." They melted into the shadows, leaving only the echo of their threats behind. As the danger receded, Willow didn't move. She stayed between Maddie and the shed, her sides heaving, eyes fixed on the place where the poachers had vanished. Maddie lowered the rifle, her hands shaking, and slowly approached the wild mother. "Hey, you did it. You protected her. And me too," Maddie whispered, awed by the bravery she'd just witnessed. Willow met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them, a recognition of shared courage, of love that refused to back down. Maddie knelt, careful not to crowd the bobcat, and watched as Scout crept from the kennel, nuzzling up to her mother's wounded side. Willow licked her kitten, all the fierceness giving way to tenderness. Maddie felt tears prick her eyes, not from fear but from pride. She had never seen anything so brave as Willow's stand. The rest of the night passed in a hush, danger and hope braided together beneath the stars. Maddie stayed close, rifle within reach, but her faith was no longer in the weapon. It was in the love that had made a wild mother risk everything, and in her own ability to face down fear when it mattered most. When the first rays of dawn broke over the snow-draped woods, Maddie finally allowed herself to exhale. She knew there would always be new threats in the wild, but now, standing shoulder to shoulder with Willow, she understood. Real bravery was love in action against the odds. Together, they had survived the storm, and together, they would face whatever came next. With the worst of the storm and the danger behind them, a new quiet settled over Maddie's cabin, a fragile, golden peace that felt almost unreal. Maddie spent her days in a careful rhythm, every action a promise that she wouldn't take the safety of Willow and Scout for granted. Now, with the threat of poachers fading into the snowy distance, she could finally turn her full attention to helping the wild family truly recover. She set to work immediately, transforming a stretch of forest behind the cabin into a sanctuary for Willow and Scout. It was a labor of love, hammering together old fencing, dragging fallen branches to reinforce the perimeter, building a sturdy shelter from salvaged lumber and thick tarps. Maddie worked late into the cold afternoons, her breath puffing in clouds, glancing over her shoulder to see Scout peeking out from the kennel. Willow always close by, eyes never straying far from her kitten. The project wasn't just for the bobcats. Maddie could feel it healing something inside her too. A need to create, to protect, to give back to the land that had taken so much, and also given her a new sense of purpose. She remembered her father's words from so long ago. "You don't belong to the wild, Maddie, but you can be its friend." She whispered those words like a mantra as she hammered, dug, and hauled, her muscles aching in the best possible way. The new enclosure was large and wild enough for Willow to feel almost at home, with room to roam, climb, and hide. Maddie scattered brush piles for cover and staked out logs for scratching posts. She fashioned a little den at one end, lining it with pine needles and straw. As she finished the last bit of fencing, snowflakes began to fall again, dusting everything in a quiet hush that seemed to say, "This is a place for hope." When it was ready, Maddie carried Scout gently from the cabin, the little bobcat wriggling and curious, and opened the kennel door. Willow emerged cautiously, limping only a little now, her coat thicker and glossier with every day of rest and food. She sniffed the air, pausing at the threshold between the small world of the cabin and the wild promise of the enclosure. Scout followed, his steps clumsy but bold. Maddie knelt just outside the fence, watching with a heart full of awe as Mother and Kitten explored their new world together. Willow led Scout on a slow, cautious circuit, testing every log and shadow. The first thing Scout did was scramble up a low branch and leap down, then dart back to Willow for reassurance. Willow nuzzled him, and Maddie smiled, feeling like she'd been allowed a front-row seat to a miracle. She kept her distance in the days that followed, resisting the urge to linger too long at the fence or interfere more than necessary. Her role, she knew, was to be a watchful guardian, not a part of the Bobcat's world. She checked on them every morning, leaving food and fresh water in sheltered spots, cleaning up old bedding, always announcing herself in a low, friendly voice before approaching. At first, Willow bristled and would retreat, snarling quietly, but Maddie respected her boundaries, backing away until Willow's body language softened, her ears turning forward, her tail still. Scout grew stronger and bolder with each sunrise. He chased snowflakes, pounced on imaginary prey, and even startled a gray squirrel who'd come looking for seeds. Maddie watched through the fence, laughter bubbling in her chest, remembering what it was to play without fear. Willow watched too, her eyes softer, her body language more relaxed. Sometimes Maddie would spot Willow sitting atop the highest log, scanning the woods with a queen's gaze, proud and vigilant. Maddie's neighbors, curious about the new construction, began stopping by. She told them what had happened, the poachers, the rescue, the long nights, and something changed in the way they looked at her. Some brought over scraps of lumber, others bags of animal feed. Even old Mrs. Hanley from down the road, who'd once complained about critters, arrived one morning with a jug of fresh milk and a shy smile. The enclosure became more than just a safe haven. It was a small symbol of what was possible when people chose compassion over convenience. Maddie felt her loneliness dissolving, replaced by this quiet network of support. She began to sleep more soundly at night, dreaming less of storms and loss and more of new beginnings. One evening, as Maddie brought out dinner, chunks of venison from the local butcher, some berries, and a bowl of clean water, Willow didn't retreat when Maddie came close. The wild mother sat quietly, her golden eyes calm, Scout pressed against her side. Maddie moved slowly, laying the food just inside the enclosure, and paused. "Thank you for trusting me, Willow," she whispered. The bobcat blinked once, slowly, in a way that felt almost like an answer. That night, a gentle snow fell, the world glowing silver beneath the moon. Maddie sat on the porch, wrapped in her father's old ranger jacket, watching Willow and Scout from a distance as they curled up together in their den, safe and warm at last. For the first time in a long time, Maddie felt whole. The wild and the human worlds would never be the same, but here, beneath the wide Colorado sky, they had found a fragile peace. Trust had grown, step by careful step, blooming in the coldest winter. And as the fire crackled behind her, Maddie knew that this too was a kind of homecoming for all of them. The days slipped gently past, the air sharpening with the kind of clean, cold brightness that only comes after a storm. Maddie felt it in her bones. The peace wasn't just outside, but within her too, finally settling after years of restlessness. Each morning she awoke before sunrise, bundled herself in her thickest sweater, and wandered out to the enclosure. where she'd watch Willow and Scout greet the day together. Sometimes she sat on an overturned log just beyond the fence, hands curled around a mug of hot coffee, content to watch in silence. She'd see Willow nudge Scout out of their den, guiding him with gentle insistence to try new things. If Scout hesitated at a fallen branch or icy patch, Willow would demonstrate, leaping gracefully, then pausing to let her kitten copy her. Other times, Maddie saw Scout lose his nerve, scampering back to his mother's side, and Willow would simply curl around him, patient as the mountain itself. Maddie was struck by how instinctively Willow parented. The wild Bobcat was fierce, yes, but there was something tender in the way she taught Scout. No lectures, no frustration, just endless, steady presence. She never pushed her kitten past his limits, but she never let him give in to fear, either. Maddie realized that this was a language older than words. Encouragement, comfort, discipline, and love, all woven together in the brush of a tail or a gentle lick. Watching them, Maddie couldn't help but reflect on her own childhood, on her mother's silent strength in those terrible months after her father died. She remembered the nights she'd curled in bed, unable to sleep, and her mother would sit beside her, hand resting on her back until the nightmares faded. No speeches, just comfort and certainty that Maddie was not alone. Sometimes love was simply showing up again and again until hope returned. One afternoon, Maddie brought her old photo album outside, flipping through the pages as Willow and Scout played nearby. There was her father, laughing with a fishing rod, waving from the summit of a mountain, cradling a rescued fawn. There was her mother, standing tall at the kitchen counter, a quiet smile on her face. Maddie pressed her thumb over the edge of the page, blinking against a sudden rush of tears. She missed them both fiercely, but she also felt them here somehow, in the crisp air and the wide blue sky, in the softness of Scout's mule and the strength in Willow's stance. That evening, as the sky deepened from blue to violet, Maddie witnessed a moment she would never forget. Scout, now sturdier and braver, tried climbing the tallest log in the enclosure. He slipped on the first try, tumbling back into the snow with a startled yowl. Maddie leaned forward, heart in her throat, but Willow didn't rush to his side. Instead, she waited, watching intently. Scout shook himself, gave a tiny sneeze and tried again, this time reaching the top, balancing with a triumphant flick of his tail. Willow patted over and touched noses with him, a simple gesture, but Maddie felt its weight. Pride, approval, and the assurance that the world could be hard, but he was never alone in it. A deep ache and gratitude welled up in Maddie's chest. She realized that Willow's lesson was not just for Scout, it was for her too. All the years she'd spent building walls, toughening herself against loneliness and pain, suddenly seemed less necessary. If a wild bobcat could risk everything, heal, and still love, so could she. That night, Maddie sat at her kitchen table, pen in hand, and wrote a letter to her mother. She described Willow and Scout, the way their bond had healed something in her own heart. She wrote about the poachers, the terror and the courage, but also about the way community had shown up. Neighbors bringing food, strangers asking about wildlife, even children leaving drawings of bobcats on her porch. For the first time, she was able to say, in ink and in her soul, that she wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, Maddie awoke to the sound of Scout calling. She rushed out, still in her pajamas, to see Willow and her kitten playing in the dawn light. Scout chased his tail, Willow pretending to pounce, both of them leaping through the snow, their joy infectious. Maddie laughed out loud, startling a flock of jays from a nearby tree. In that moment, she felt connected not just to these two wild creatures, but to every mother, every daughter, every person who'd ever loved or been loved, no matter how different their worlds. Later that week, a local school teacher called to ask if Maddie would speak to her class about the bobcats. Maddie hesitated at first, her old shyness flaring, but then she thought of Willow, how courage could be as quiet as sitting beside someone in the dark. She agreed, and when the day came, she brought photos, told the story of Willow and Scout, and watched as the children's faces lit up with wonder. Maybe, she thought, this was another lesson from motherhood, that love, when shared, could ripple outward, touching lives she'd never even meet. Winter was far from over. Nights were still bitterly cold, and dangers remained. But in the glow of the wood stove, Maddie found a sense of peace she'd never known before. She watched Willow and Scout curled together in their den, her heart full of gratitude for the lessons of motherhood, for the healing of old wounds, and for the hope that grew even in the coldest winter, when love was brave enough to reach across every divide. Winter clung to the Colorado forest, but the cabin felt warmer than ever. Each sunrise brought new hope. Every sunset stitched together another piece of Maddie's heart. What had started as a desperate act of rescue had grown into something so much bigger, a current of change that reached beyond the quiet clearing, rippling out to touch lives Maddie never expected. At first, Maddie noticed little things. The school visit sparked a quiet buzz. Children came with questions, their parents following close behind. They left drawings taped to the gate, some showing bobcats and kittens, others with Maddie in her ranger uniform standing tall beside the wild mother and baby. It was simple and sweet, but it tugged at Maddie in ways she hadn't felt in years. She hung the best ones on her kitchen wall, smiling every time she caught a glimpse. One snowy morning, Maddie heard a knock and opened the door to find two of her neighbors from up the road. Gus, with his battered pickup, and Angie, arms full of old blankets and a can of fresh paint. "We were thinking," Angie said, a little sheepish, "maybe we could help fix up that shed of yours and, well, see the bobcats if it's safe." Gus nodded, cheeks red from the cold. "Figured you could use an extra set of hands." Maddie hesitated. She'd kept Willow and Scout's presence quiet to protect them, but the trust she'd built was holding strong, and it felt right to let her neighbors in, carefully, on her terms. She showed them the enclosure from a respectful distance, explaining the rules. No sudden moves, no loud voices, and no trying to pet or feed the wild mother. Gus and Angie listened, wide-eyed, amazed at how close they could get to such beauty. "Didn't know you had this in you, Maddie," Gus said with a grin. "Guess you're part bobcat yourself." Word spread slowly but steadily. Maddie found herself answering calls from folks she'd barely spoken to before. Ranchers asking how to keep livestock safe without cruel traps. Hikers reporting suspicious activity in the woods. The old sense of isolation that had clung to Maddie for so long began to crack. The cabin was no longer a fortress against the world, but a beacon, a place where people gathered not just for help, but to learn and share. The ripple effect wasn't limited to humans either. That February, Maddie spotted new animal tracks crossing her land. Foxes, elk, even a pair of cautious coyotes. Maybe they sensed the change, too. The land felt more alive, more respected, as if all the wild things understood this patch of forest was being watched over with new care. One night, Maddie hosted a community meeting at the cabin. Folks crowded inside, stomping snow off their boots, balancing mugs of coffee on their knees as Maddie spoke about poaching. about wildlife corridors, and what it meant to coexist. She showed pictures of Willow's wound, Scout's early days, and the painstaking progress they'd made. People listened with real attention, faces somber and then hopeful. When Maddie finished, there was a hush, then a round of applause. Not loud or flashy, but warm and real. Someone suggested forming a volunteer watch for the backwoods trails. Another offered to donate trail cameras to catch any illegal activity. After the meeting, Maddie stepped outside into the crisp air, her breath rising in little clouds. Angie came out, handing Maddie a folded note. Inside, a thank you from her daughter, scribbled in crayon. "Thank you for helping the wild kitties. I want to be brave like you." Maddie's throat tightened. She pressed the note to her heart, overwhelmed by the simple, honest gratitude of it. Back at the enclosure, Willow and Scout watched the activity from their safe den, eyes bright and wary, but no longer afraid. Willow seemed to sense the shift, the quiet confidence in Maddie's step, the gentle voices of neighbors instead of the sharp crack of danger. That night, as the sky cleared and the stars glittered overhead, Maddie sat outside the fence, feeling the presence of her unlikely family. She spoke softly, her words drifting through the wire. "You did this, Willow. You taught me, and now you're teaching all of us." Scout, growing more adventurous by the day, climbed the nearest log and chirped, a sound that always made Maddie laugh. Willow, ever watchful, didn't stop him this time. Maddie saw herself reflected in that trust, that cautious permission to explore, knowing someone strong would always be nearby. Days passed, each one weaving Maddie further into the fabric of her community. The local high school art class painted a mural of Willow and Scout along the town library wall. A retired trapper stopped by with a promise to dismantle any old snares he found, shaking Maddie's hand with surprising gentleness. Even the regional newspaper ran a feature story. Ranger's act of kindness sparks wildlife revival. Maddie grinned at the headline, but what mattered most wasn't the attention. It was seeing change, real and lasting, grow from a single act of compassion. At times, Maddie wondered what her father would think if he could see her now. No longer the grieving girl lost in the shadows, but a woman with roots in her community and a calling that reached beyond herself. She imagined him smiling, proud of her courage and her heart. The unspoken bond between Maddie and the Bobcats deepened. Willow would sometimes sit at the edge of the enclosure, eyes meeting Maddie's across the fence. There was no fear, only understanding, a silent acknowledgement of all they'd survived and all they'd given each other. Maddie knew the wild could never be tamed, nor should it be, but trust could bloom even in the harshest winter. As winter's grip began to loosen and hints of spring crept into the air, Maddie realized she was less alone than she'd ever imagined. The lesson she'd learned, and helped others see, was simple. Every act of kindness mattered. Every ripple, no matter how small, could change the world. As the final weeks of winter melted slowly into spring, the world around Maddie Carter's cabin began to transform. The snow softened and retreated, revealing patches of brown earth and the first shoots of wild grass. Ice on the river cracked and shimmered in the lengthening sun. The air, once sharp with cold, now held the faintest scent of thaw and new life. Maddie stood on the porch most mornings, coffee warming her hands, watching as the forest seemed to exhale after holding its breath for so long. Inside the enclosure, Willow and Scout were changing too. Scout, once a trembling bundle of fur, had grown long-legged and sure-footed. His playful leaps had become graceful, and his curiosity stretched far beyond the fence. Willow's wound had healed into a faint scar, but her spirit was unchanged, still wild, still fierce, but now tinged with a quiet trust. Maddie marveled at them every day, feeling as if she'd witnessed a miracle not just in their survival, but in the transformation of their hearts. It was time, Maddie realized, for another change, a letting go. The wild belonged to Willow and Scout. She'd given them sanctuary, but the true gift was letting them find their place in the world again. It wasn't an easy decision. Maddie paced her kitchen for hours that first morning the idea took root, turning it over and over in her mind. Could they really make it on their own? Had she done enough? But watching Scout stalk imaginary prey beneath the budding aspens, and seeing Willow survey her world with that unmistakable pride, Maddie understood. The forest was calling them home. She spent the next few days preparing for the release, making sure the woods beyond the enclosure were safe, checking for traps, scattering extra food, alerting her neighbors and fellow rangers to keep an eye out for the bobcats, but not interfere. The whole community seemed to share in the anticipation. Gus stopped by to help mend a weak spot in the fence, and Angie brought fresh venison scraps as a parting feast. Even the children sent notes, wishing Willow and Scout luck in their new adventures. On the morning of the release, the sun rose bright and strong, glinting off the last patches of snow. Maddie knelt beside the gate, hands trembling a little as she unlatched the door. Willow waited with regal patience, Scout pressed to her side, both of them keenly aware that something was about to change. Maddie stepped back, her heart thumping. She whispered, "Go on. This is your home. Be brave." For a moment, Willow hesitated. Then, with a low, rumbling purr, she led Scout through the open gate, pausing only once to look back. Their eyes met, human and wild, two mothers whose courage had remade the world around them. In that silent exchange, Maddie felt a surge of emotion, joy and sorrow woven together so tightly that for a moment she couldn't breathe. Scout bounded forward, testing the earth beyond the enclosure with cautious delight. Willow followed, every step measured, but her tail held high. They vanished into the trees, leaving only faint paw prints in the melting snow. Maddie stayed there long after they were gone, watching the shadows shift and listening to the forest breathe. She was filled not with emptiness, but with a deep sense of completion. She'd done what she set out to do, not just save 2 lives, but change her own in the process. As days passed, Maddie returned often to the place where the enclosure had been, sometimes finding tracks or a flash of movement in the distance. She left food in hidden spots, more out of habit than necessity, and wrote every detail in her journal. Her own story, now forever intertwined with theirs. The impact didn't stop with the bobcats' return to the wild. The lessons Maddie learned and shared had rooted themselves in the community. Trail cameras were installed up and down the park's borders, deterring poachers and making everyone more vigilant. The high school's mural of Willow and Scout became a local landmark, a symbol of hope and resilience for all who passed by. Even Maddie's old loneliness faded, replaced by friendships built around a shared mission. Letters from around the state began to arrive. Thanks from people who'd read the story in the paper, requests for advice on wildlife protection, even poems and sketches inspired by the tale. One letter from a grandmother in a city hundreds of miles away said simply, "You made me believe in kindness again." Maddie kept these messages in a box by her bedside. On sleepless nights, she'd read through them, comforted by the thought that one small act could ripple so far, so quietly, and yet so powerfully. As the forest bloomed, Maddie found herself busier than ever, speaking at schools, helping neighbors set up safe gardens, organizing patrols with other rangers. But she always made time for a solitary walk at dusk, pausing by the river where the first wildflowers were pushing up through the mud. Sometimes, when the breeze was just right, she thought she heard Willow's yowl echoing from the hills, Scout's lighter chirp not far behind. She smiled, a quiet, private joy. One evening, as the sky blazed orange and violet, Maddie gathered the community for a simple celebration. Hot drinks, laughter, and a moment to honor all that had changed. She spoke quietly, not one for grand speeches, but her words rang true. For me, this isn't just a story of wild survival. It's about the unbreakable bond between mother and child, and how compassion can bridge even the widest divide. If this story moved you, pass it on to someone who needs hope, or share your own. Sometimes the greatest gifts come from the courage to care. Support your local wildlife, or simply look out for those in need, human or animal. You never know how one small act of kindness can echo through the coldest winter. As twilight deepened, Maddie stood at the edge of the woods, her heart at peace. Somewhere, Willow and Scout moved quietly beneath the stars, their bond and the hope they inspired, outlasting even the fiercest storm. And so, the story of Maddie, Willow, and Scout became a winter's gift for all who heard it. A reminder that every life matters, every act of love counts, and that even in the coldest season, hope will find a way to bloom.